Welcome to Plato's Academy. I'm Alex Plato, and if you like what we're doing, then like, subscribe, and share this video. Well, got this question from our producer. I think it's pretty good. And we've talked about this kind of thing before.
Yeah.
I know I have.
It's a
with him
difficult
as well.
question.
It is. And
So
the
it's
question
tricky.
is, does God have emotion?
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it?
It is.
I mean, it's partly tricky.
I'll let
because,
you go first.
Yeah, I think it's partly tricky because if we say that he doesn't, then he seems like he's not a personal being, right? And we don't want to say that. On the other hand, if we say that he does, then he seems less than a supreme being because he's subject to all the realm of feelings like we are. So it seems like either way you answer, right, you end up with something you don't want. And so it's very tricky. So obviously one of the chief questions we need to talk about is what's it mean to have emotions?
Yep.
Right. Now,
We got to go philosophical and ask what things mean.
Yes, we have to do that
Yeah.
first. And so I
Yeah.
think that clearly what sets up that dilemma I began with is a view of emotions where emotions are kind of effects in your heart, in your soul, right? So you're like affected by someone in a certain way, and there's like this perturbation inside, right? This change happens inside of you, and you've reacted to some stimuli or some
anger.
person or some anger, right? And any of the normal emotions we could think of. And so if that's what an emotion is, and we have this idea that God can't change, that seems on the face of it incompatible. On the other hand, right? So even if we say God doesn't have those kind of emotions, and we say, well, he has unchanging emotions, what would those be like? So you might say something like God is happiness itself. He delights in himself, or God takes joy, right? Or even just look at any descriptions of God in the Old Testament. Like there's to describe the personal action of any personal being, right? It requires reference to different emotional states, we'd say.
Right, but that's just, we can at least say that's how he's described.
Yes. So
He is described that way. He
so
is
the
described as
description,
being angry.
Yes. So the description doesn't entail that he has emotions in our sense.
Right.
So if we start with a thesis to avoid the dilemmas we're talking about, that God, let's say God has, the hypothesis, God has emotions, but those emotions cannot be reactions, you might say, because God doesn't change. So can we square that circle, that God can have emotions, but God doesn't change? How do we square that
My
circle?
first thought is you're going to go more philosophical, and my first thought was to go right to the second person of the Trinity, the incarnate. God, Christ, is
Yes.
that he had emotions.
Yes,
and
but-
he was God.
That's true, but he had emotions, you might say, qua man. We're
Okay,
not,
yeah,
because
I
he's
see-
like
I
us
see.
in all ways.
Yeah, I see how you could do that too.
So we can't. So that move, you might think that might help us, but that doesn't, because we say that Christ
as
as
God.
God
Right.
is uncreated.
Yeah.
Right. Christ as man is created.
Yes.
Right. Christ as God is eternal.
Yeah.
Christ as man is temporal.
Yes,
And so
okay.
on. So that's called the reduplicative
So
move.
it seems like you could reduplicate or whatever and say God is not emotion and Christ is emotional.
Yes.
God is not emotional.
Yes,
and
so
Christ
it doesn't
is
answer our
emotional.
question. That's what I'm
Yeah,
trying to say.
okay.
The reference to the hypostatic union and Christ's experience as a man doesn't answer our question.
That's good. I think that's
Yeah.
good to get there, because I think that many people probably listening are thinking
Yeah.
the same thing as me. It's like, okay, that's my first thought, but okay, that's not God as God. That's Christ as a human. Okay. So let's keep rolling.
So I think that here's where I would go. So we have the thesis that God doesn't change. Remember, our hypothesis, he doesn't change, but he has emotions. We're trying to make that a hypothesis that's consistent with itself. So how could God change and have emotions? So if he has emotions, it has to be something like eternal emotions. So let's use the example of God being delighting in himself. So God obviously is the perfect personal being. And so he loves the highest good the most, right? And so any rational being, any personal being knows that they ought to love the highest good the most. So God is a personal being, so he loves the highest good the most. The highest good is the divine essence. So he loves the divine essence the most.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm following.
Now, when you possess, right, the highest good, and of course, loving the highest good is a way to possess it. You might say, then you experience enjoyment or happiness. So that naturally comes. So God is, right, supreme joy. God is happiness itself. That's what St. Bonaventure says. He is supreme happiness. That's what Boethius says. Right? So all our great thinkers say somehow he is happiness. He's like, what do I say? Omni-happy.
Yeah.
Right? He's omniscient.
But you put a
right?
different
omnipotent.
word. But I like
Yeah.
what you're saying, and it makes sense. But to put a different word does make the challenge. And I see a little bit what John was thinking, is to say God is cheerful. So for some reason, it works
Right.
to me with he's he is happiness, because that sounds
Yes.
really philosophical.
Yes.
But to say God is cheerfulness,
Yes.
that's different.
Yeah,
little
that's
bit.
different. That is different. It's right. But when I say God is, and then I say something like happiness, it's already hard to understand that. Or God is
Yeah.
justice.
Yeah. Any kind of predication.
Any sort of
makes it difficult.
abstraction,
Yeah.
right? That's not like God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, or something like that, or God is merciful, or God is powerful, or something that He does, right? Where it's some sort of inner psychological description, where all our terms that we have are from our experience. So there's always going to be a little bit of like, well, it doesn't quite fit. But we're just trying to say, is there any way that you could have emotions, but
And
you
not
eternally
change?
have them?
Yeah.
So not change.
Well, I think of Chesterton in the this might not answer the question, but just thinking about what you're saying, because it's difficult to think about this for sure. Is Chesterton has the thing about how God is too young to understand, not too old. You remember that part?
Yeah.
And that he can exult in monotony like a child does. So when you open a door and go boo
Yeah.
to a kid, they laugh
Yeah.
and then close it, and then
You do that
open again, boo,
forever, and
they
they're
laugh,
always
and
amused.
they're always
And
amused.
they say, "Do it again, Daddy."
Yeah, do it again. They can exult in monotony. Where God is so young, He can exult in monotony and be delighted every single time the
Yes.
flower
Blooms.
blooms.
Yeah,
Every
the
single
sun
time the
comes up.
sun comes up.
Yeah.
In that sense, I can understand what you're talking about. Again, it's in my experience with change, but it's the only way to understand.
Yep.
God is so young and so wonderful. He can enjoy. He never gets bored.
Yeah. So I'm trying to get
I
there.
don't know if
think
that helped
that does help
in
and
any
that,
way. At least help me.
Yeah. So there's two things I'm trying to get to. Is that one is thinking about God in Himself.
Yeah.
So He has to have an unchanging emotional state if He has emotions, right? Because the thesis that He's changeable is not. We can't adhere to that. Right now, we could come back and try to question that, because some modern theologians try to question that God is changeless.
Okay.
Right. But then that's one element, thinking about God in Himself. But obviously, we're thinking about God in relation to creation. Now, that's completely different, because God creates ex nihilo, which doesn't change God.
Yes.
So now we have some sort of dynamic reality that wasn't there before, right? Or wasn't. So God has this, and that's not eternal. It's not like we're Aristotle, where this whole thing's eternal.
Right.
It came from nothing. There was no time, and now time is.
Such an important doctrine.
Yes. So the
doctrine of
relationship of God to creation, to me, is one of the most difficult philosophical topics to understand, right? Let alone just God in Himself.
Yeah.
So now if you say, well, what is God's relationship to creation? Here's what we have to say. We can't say that there was a creation and then God knows it. So it's not like God discovers the way this is and then responds.
Okay.
So then if He has emotions that are related to this, it can't be the emotions of, you might
Responding.
say, responding in that way, because He,
That
in
makes
His
sense.
eternal counsel, He laid out the vast order of this cosmos in His eternal counsel prior to the creation. And then that eternal order is displayed, right, in His counsel. And it was free for Him to come up with that plan. He could have created anything or not created nothing. And then He displays this order. So in a certain way, He already has all the emotions in His eternal counsel for this order, you might say. So the emotions come from what God's doing with respect to His own life. He's, you might say, adding something, right, to His life that He doesn't have to, which is the creation. And so His emotions are already all correlated, right, to the things that happen in the world. You might say fate, if we put it that way. So fate from the point of view of a pagan is providence from the point of view of a Christian. There's a meticulous order that's laid out, and God knew it all, right, ahead of time. So we have these two ideas, God in Himself and then God in relation to creation. And the thesis of God is unchangeable, it has emotions, has to make sense of both of those.
It does. In my mind right now, where I've gone is that the two things you said, but I still don't understand the answer to the question
Yep.
fully. And I don't know if you've laid that out, but I
haven't.
get the idea. You have God in Himself, how to think about God in Himself, and you have how to think about God relating to the creation. And you said that emotions isn't like us, because that involves change or responding to something that you don't know or being something like that. That's not God, since He's eternal. If He is emotional, it's eternally emotional. And I think I can make sense that if He's emotional, He's eternally emotional. But in thinking differently of when you use the term "you're emotional," like I say that sometimes about maybe my kids, you're being emotional. It's not like that, because there's no sin, obviously, and anything like that. But here's the hard thing: it's hard for me to think that God's eternally angry.